Hello, my name is Kristen Lyons, and I am joining you today from Jagera and Turrbal country here in southeast Queensland, Australia, where I live and work at the University of Queensland. I'm also a senior research fellow with the Oakland Institute. I want to say sincere thanks to the Yale School of Environment for the invitation to join you. A wonderful opportunity for my colleague and friend, Frederick Mousseau, to speak with you together, me via this recording and Frederick live, and explore some of the themes related to the social and environmental and including rights dimensions of global carbon offset initiatives. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'll just share my screen with you and dive into the presentation. These images that I include here to start are really to take you to some of the key themes that I want to explore with you today, which draw from the work that I've been engaged in Uganda for the last decade or so. So this image on the left takes you to northern Uganda, to one of the sites I've spent a little bit of time. And this is a large-scale industrial monoculture pine plantation, which has for a time been sequestering carbon for sale into the global carbon offset market. And this is an initiative that's been driven by the company Green Resources, which I'm hoping might anchor the thinking that we do together and that you go on and talk about perhaps with Frederick as well, around the extent to which carbon offset initiatives might provide a so-called magic bullet, as many of the champions advocate, to support the rapid decarbonisation that we so urgently need. Secondly, the extent to which international carbon markets might be part of ensuring a just and fair transition in an era of climate constraint. Or thirdly, a third dimension I'd like us to think about is the ways in which carbon markets may in fact provide security for big polluters to keep doing what they do, pollute big. So these are the themes that I'm hoping will thread through the discussion today. So to be sure we're all on the same page, what am I talking about here when we talk about carbon offset? And I'm assuming that you're all acutely aware. So in simple terms, carbon offset programs are based on the premise that industrial polluters, predominantly in the global north, are able to pay others to essentially offset their carbon emissions. So forests and forestry carbon offset are amongst those. These and an array of other initiatives promise to reduce anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions via absorbing and the storage of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in carbon sinks, including soil and trees. So to do this, they rely upon that controversial and contested space of global carbon accounting. So at its core, carbon accounting relies upon the assumption that complex landscapes in which humans and more than humans are well and truly enmeshed can be reduced down to a single commodity, carbon. And that this volume that is held in the case of plantation forestry, which I want to talk about today with you, that this can be calculated and therefore it can be priced and sold on to a polluting industry, company or country. Such calculations, of course, as I'm sure many of you are well and truly aware, fail to measure the emissions associated with the disruptions to previous land use, for example, to make way for plantation forestry, or secondly, the displacement of environmental damages and emissions that occur outside plantation forestry sites. And these are just some of the many limitations of global carbon accounting. So as a mechanism, global carbon accounting also relies upon the enclosure of landscapes. And that image I presented in the first slide really seeks to speak to that, this fortressing, this locking up of land so as to ensure the commodity of carbon. This ensures staking out the territories, defending the borders of carbon offset projects. And indeed, the logic is that the efficiency of large-scale monoculture plantation forestry relies upon the removal of people who are frequently seen as a threat to these projects and as antithetical to the project objectives. So as a result, various livelihood activities that frequently take place on landscapes in which carbon offset activities take place, such as growing and collecting food, grazing animals, collecting firewood, and so on, are often seen as incompatible with carbon sequestration. So like I said, in the work that I have been doing, which has been connected with the Oakland Institute, and we have published a series of reports, and the Oakland Institute has continued in this work with a series of reports in the last couple of years that have been led by fieldwork undertaken by David Semwongarere. And David and I have worked together in the past. Obviously, I haven't been to Uganda in the last couple of years, but David has been conducting some really important research for us at the Oakland Institute to continue to understand the on-ground impacts of the ongoing existence of Green Resources, the company I'll introduce more fully in a moment to you in Uganda at a couple of different sites. And so what our research over the many years that we've been engaged in Uganda in this space has shown is the ways in which this particular Norwegian-owned company, Green Resources, has deployed various forms of violence, which we describe as structural violence or slow forms of violence in defense of its plantation borders. And this has delivered phenomenal adverse impacts for local communities, and in the end, in recent years, has been associated with the loss of, or the termination of, the sole carbon credit buyer, the Swedish Energy Agency, terminating their contract back in 2020. So these questions then, which I want us to explore today, are here, which I've set out before you. So this is the framework by which I want to bring you into now, introducing Green Resources, the case study that Frederick and I want to speak with you about today. So Green Resources, like I said, is a Norwegian plantation forestry, carbon offset, forest products and renewable energy company. They champion themselves as being a good corporate citizen in this space and across these range of forestry related activities. They make claims to having planted more trees in Africa than any other private company in recent years, with plantations in Mozambique, Tanzania, as well as Uganda, and have invested over US $125 million in tree planting activities, as well as supporting and instituting a range of local community development initiatives around education, community health, local infrastructure, and so on. It also claims to be one of the first international companies to receive carbon revenue from the sale of its carbon credits through the sale of carbon credits from its northern Uganda site to the Swedish Energy Agency. But like I said, this contract has now terminated, directly tied to its poor conduct at its northern Ugandan site. So I want to very briefly now turn to speak to some of the local level impacts, and in so doing show this demarcation between the corporate claims about corporate social responsibility and being able to balance both environmental and social good as part of its global leadership in this forestry space, versus the lived reality on the ground. This work draws from in-depth field work over repeat visits that adds up to a total of about 5 months in the field for myself. And like I said, David Semwongarere has continued on this work, and this has been supported by the Oakland Institute over time. So Green Resources operate in 2 sites in Uganda. I want to draw particularly from its northern Uganda site, which trades under the name of the Lengo Forest Company, because this is where they were generating carbon credits for a period of time. Northern Uganda, in this part of Uganda, rates of poverty are particularly high compared to the national average, and life expectancy remains lower than the national average. The region also faces disproportionate challenges compared to the rest of the nation in terms of access to vital services such as education, safe drinking water, sanitation, and health services. So it's here that Green Resources has, as I've said, established plantation forestry operations of predominantly pine, but a small area of eucalyptus as well. They also trialed a very, very small area in local species, but this, according to the company, was not successful, these local tree varieties. So as a little background to Green Resources, it obtained a license from the Ugandan government through the National Forestry Authority to establish its plantation forestry in 1999. So this is an over 20-year operation. Its first planting commenced in 2006, and planting has now completed with, like I said, the establishment and management of a mostly monoculture plantation in northern Uganda of around 2,050 hectares. There are at least 17 villages in direct proximity to the Kachung license area in northern Uganda, and it is here that communities are small-scale subsistence farming, reliant upon fishing and livestock herding as well. Given the absolute reliance upon land for subsistence food production and grazing in this area, the substantial loss of land through to it being locked up for this plantation forestry operation has exacerbated the already acute challenges that many local communities in this region already face. So I want to just very briefly speak to 4 key themes in which we see diverse forms of slow violence and sometimes direct forms of violence play out across people's lives and livelihoods. The first relates to the destruction of food and farming landscapes as a direct result of the arrival of green resources. And this has happened in immediate and profound ways, such as the destruction of crops. And many people that we talked to described staff from Green Resources physically removing crops, as well as confiscating animals that might be grazing in Green Resources licensed areas. The consequence of this has meant that the area that people have to access land for growing has been curtailed. People are responding, local communities are responding by changing the food crops that they grow, including growing things that have a quicker maturation rate. People also describe eating less as a survival strategy, as well as engaging in trading relationships, including markets within sites of Green Resources land, which are technically illegal given the license agreements, but as vital strategies to try and maintain secure access to food. So the pressures that have been bared down upon people have been absolutely profound, and this has remained over the years an ongoing issue that Green Resources has faced and been forced to defend. How are they responding to the phenomenal food security challenges of local communities? And they have responded in a number of ways over the years, including offering a range of food farming courses, the introduction of cook stoves, quick cook stoves, or fuel efficient cook stoves, sorry, I should say, and so on. And so while there have been some interventions from Green Resources in direct response to growing international outrage about the lived experience for people on the ground, this has continued to fall well short of what local communities are in vital need of, and that is of sufficient land to grow food. What is also acutely aware in this context is that not everybody is treated the same. So whilst at the same time, many community members we've spoken to described being excluded, forcibly removed, and then exclusions maintained so that people cannot access land in Green Resources licensed area. At the same time, not everybody is treated the same. And here, this image I show you is actually from the southern Ugandan side at Busoga. But what it demonstrates is cattle being grazed within the trunks of these taller eucalyptus trees. And when we stopped to talk to this person, they were employed by someone to graze these cattle, and their understanding was that they did have permission to do this. So what this speaks to is, on the one hand, this clear line of no trespassing is allowed, but not everybody is equal in this context. Directly related to this is the ways in which people have lost access to rights and the livelihood activities that are vital to sustenance living in proximity to these plantation sites. So I've spoken about the ways in which this land, that plantation forestry, have been established upon as vital for food growing, but there's a range of other economic activities that people derive from having access to this land, whether that be the collection of forest products, for example, or as I've spoken about, grazing, a range of different ways in which people utilise the diverse landscapes that existed prior to the plantation forestry establishing. People also access these diverse ecological zones to procure medicines and other locally utilised resources that exist within these diverse ecological landscapes. But all of these rights have been curtailed. And on this basis, we heard these powerful stories from community members about how life has become very dangerous. And with one participant we spoke to describing that if these conditions prevail, our life and our livelihoods will be gone. A third dimension of slow violence, and part of this broader thinking around carbon violence and the way in which it plays out for local communities in this area, is the disruption to culture. And this includes the destruction of sites of cultural significance, as well as people being removed from and not allowed to access sites that actually were vital for cultural practices. And I include here an image of the Walumbi tree, which many local community members talked about as an important site, as a site that it was important to visit, but that it was so far from where people now lived, because so many people have been removed from this landscape, that it has become increasingly difficult to access. But also, as you can see in this image, the plantation forestry has been established right up to the tree, thereby disrupting the site itself. So all sorts of challenges in this context. I'm sort of rushing through these themes quite quickly. I hope that's okay. So the fourth theme that community members frequently spoke about was the significant environmental destruction directly tied to the arrival of industrial large-scale monoculture plantings. There was an environmental impact assessment conducted for the establishment of these plantations. It happened late, and many community members, including some local officials, describe it not being enforced. There is a chemical regimen that is used, particularly in the early startup phase of the plantation. This has runoff and downstream effects. Both of the sites that Green Resources have access to are in areas of ecological significance. They are in direct proximity to very large lakes that are vital water sources for the country and indeed for the region. And so the use of chemicals and other activities associated with the plantation in proximity to these lakes, but also the wetlands that surround them, creates a whole range of ecological issues and challenges. So there's a range of issues there to be explored. Of course, the monoculture nature of these plantations raises a whole order of issues as well. So there's no doubt, as I said at the start, that Green Resources' response to these criticisms over the years has been one of, that aligns very much with their agenda for corporate social responsibility. Green Resources describe the way in which they have engaged in a range of local community development interventions, as I mentioned earlier. Indeed, 10% of their profits from Kachung are intended to be directed towards community projects. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, that they've implemented projects related to health, education, as well as a scholarship program for girls in schools. And so while these projects have delivered some tangible benefits for some people in affected communities, on the basis of our ongoing assessment, including the work that David Samongarere has been doing in recent years, we can see that these interventions fall well short of what local communities actually need and frequently don't align with the sort of agenda for local community change that communities are seeking. So we see this disconnect between global green developmentalism led by external actors and external expertise versus the lived reality on the ground and the expertise and local ecological knowledges on the ground. And so overall, we see, you know, from our in-depth interviews with communities, is that, you know, people are describing a disconnect between local aspirations and corporate claims making about what good corporate conduct might look like. So overwhelmingly, villagers spoke of loss of land and growing hunger as the most pressing issues, and these issues that have endured as well. You know, people also talk about sanitation, health and education, but the question of land and food continues to remain profoundly important. And I guess this speaks here in this quote included on the slide that one person described in an interview: what is the use of medicine, such as that provided through the health clinics that Green Resources have constructed, if we have no land to grow food and we have no schools to ensure there is a future for our children? So there's this